It really is just an honor and a privilege to be here. I'm so grateful to Dr. Weiser for letting me join you guys. It's really humbling to follow in the footsteps of the two prior SUS Global Surgery Scholar awardees. I was a little intimidated to even apply for this, given the stature of the people that have gone before me, but I am honored to represent the SUS in this talk. I don't have any disclosures, but again, I do want to thank the SUS for doing this, and hopefully for part of my goal with this talk and with using this award is to show people sort of the early to early mid-career path in global surgery, how you can make that a part of your career if it's something you're interested in, and all of the struggles that have sort of led up to some ongoing successes, because no path is completely straightforward. And I'm very lucky to do what I do, but it's not always been a direct path to success. So a couple of things I'd like to do today. First, it would be wrong to present a talk without any sort of background data or setting the stage. So we're going to briefly go over some of the key data in the global surgical burden of disease. I'd like to talk about some of the successes and challenges of building virtual collaborations, which we really had to shift towards in the last couple of years. And then define some of the strategies that more experientially we've discovered lead to optimizing virtual and hybrid work, because that's the world we live in now, and it's up to us to make it as successful as we possibly can. I'm mostly going to talk about three separate sort of global surgery roles that I have and that I'm privileged to work with. One being a role in the Association of Academic Global Surgery. This is a relatively new organization, probably within the last 5 to 6 years, that was sort of sprung forward out of the American College of Surgeons with some support from Operation Giving Back to really get people together who were interested in this path of what we were calling academic global surgery, and make a true international, multi-continental sort of group for people to collaborate, work together, and really define what this field actually is, what success looks like, how do we optimize all of our efforts, and really work together in building partnerships. And so I've been lucky to be on the executive committee for this for the last several years, serving first in the role of recorder and then in a newly defined role of the vice president of strategy. So we're strategizing how we're going to do this. My second big involvement that I'm going to talk about today is with our partnership between the University of Wisconsin's Department of Surgery and Operation Giving Back, or ACS HOPE's collaborative with Hawassa University. We were lucky to be sort of at the beginning of that partnership and kind of help pivot that through COVID into what it's become today. And then finally, I'm just going to briefly talk about some of my early involvement with COSEXA, the College of Surgeons of Eastern, Central, and Southern Africa, and talk a little bit about what that allowed me to do as an early career surgeon, and how I've been able to form some really lasting relationships with that group. And it's become one of my favorite annual events that I'm able to do each year. I'm going to steal the definition from our AAGS definition of academic global surgery, which is the application of research, education, and evidence-based advocacy towards clinical surgical care in regions of health inequities. Now, anyone who's ever been on a strategic planning retreat or on an executive council probably understands how many hours and hours of debate and argument went into defining creating this as our definition. Every single word is scrutinized, and in hopes that we can form something that really captures the essence of what we're trying to do. And we wanted to make it clinically relevant, but also relevant to the academic component of global surgery, which is what we're really trying to move forward here. For our background, these are often slides that are brought up in global surgery talks, but I think it sets a nice stage for the scope of the problem and what we're dealing with. So this is a figure from The Lancet in 2015 showing the proportion of a population without access to surgery. If you look at this map closely, you'll see it's not exclusively a problem in Africa or in South Asia. That is where it tends to be concentrated, but there are places all across the world that can be considered surgical deserts. There are plenty of places in the United States without access to care, and we'll show some more slides on that here in a few minutes. So it's a huge problem. More than 5 billion, and this is probably even worse at this point now, more than 5 billion in the world without access to surgical care. That's more than half of the world can't get the key surgical procedures if they need it. Old estimates were 143 million additional procedures were needed. Everyone here probably knows how hard it is to get cases on in the operating room. I don't expect that you guys have any different struggles than we do at Wisconsin. That's a lot of procedures to get on the schedule. 33 million people face catastrophic health expenditures across the globe. And many people are really far from hospital care. I don't think we often think about how far you have to travel to actually get to a hospital. Where I live in Madison, I'm 3 blocks from one hospital, 3 blocks from another hospital, and neither of those are the hospitals that I actually work at. So it's very easy for me to get there. However, if you look at people in low-income countries or lower resource settings, they may be 70 kilometers from their nearest hospital, and that is very difficult to get to. So it can be really hard to access surgical care even if it's nearby. Surgery is really safe and cost-effective as a public health initiative. One of the best things I was able to do early on in my career was have the support of the University of Wisconsin to pursue my master's in public health. And if anyone in the room has that, I think you know it changes a little bit of the way you think about problem solving. It really changed the way I was able to look at what we were doing and how effective it might be. And if you look at this figure from the Global Surgery 2030 article, it shows that most surgical interventions, so things such as general surgery, cleft palate repair, circumcision, all of these things are as cost effective as bed nets for malaria prevention, and markedly more cost effective than things like antiretroviral therapy or aspirin and beta blockers. So surgery really should be something that we're working to provide for everyone in the world. And you get a lot of pushback, I think, in some of the public health worlds when you think about the costs associated with surgery. It's not a cheap intervention, but it can be cost effective. Those two things are not mutually exclusive. And finally, let's put it in context in the United States. These are old figures as well from 2006, but there's a huge portion of the United States that doesn't have access to a surgeon. And I love this figure because all of these beige areas across the United States, again, lower populations, but no access to surgeons. And I particularly fixate on this one because if you look right there, that tiny little county in West Texas is where I was born and raised. So I grew up with a Walmart being 90 miles away, much less a surgeon being anywhere nearby. So this is not an exclusively international problem. This happens here around the globe, and it's something that we need to address. So when we think about global surgery, a lot of times we get a pushback of, oh, it's a mission trip. Oh, you're going on your mission trip. Or, oh, you're going on vacation. And it's certainly not that. Global surgery has evolved into much more than just mission trips. I would argue that there's still a tremendous need for our clinical involvement. There is a massive burden of disease that we can help clinically, but a lot more of our role has shifted into education and collaboration. This was the first opportunity I had to operate as faculty in rural Kenya, where we were doing huge volume of goiter surgery and working with the local residents to train them on ultrasound use and how to do safe, large thyroid surgeries. And the only reason I have the thumbs down is because I don't know if you guys can tell in this photo, but the power's out. There's no electricity. And I think that once you've done surgery without electricity, a lot of things don't bother you anymore. You're much more adaptable in terms of what you can do safely and how you're able to adapt what equipment you use, how you solve the problem. It just forces you to think a little bit outside of the box. And it turns out a lot of times you don't need all of the things you think you need. So I think there's a tremendous clinical benefit to learning how to operate in a low resource setting and work with your partners there. But I would say it has benefited me even more on the flip side back home, because I'm definitely, and I do have data to support this, I'm not going to show it, but I have the data. I'm the cheapest surgeon in our division by far and the fastest. And so I get a lot of pushback for not using fancy equipment. Like, I don't use any sort of energy device in my thyroid surgeries. I just use ties and clips. But it's really important for the residents to see that you can do that. And what would you do if you didn't have power? What would you do if you don't like that debakey? Throw it on the floor, see what happens. You're not going to get another one. So it's a very helpful learning experience for some of the trainees that have gone with me to operate in these settings. But also, I've learned more from the trainees I've worked with. Having that experience very early on in my faculty career has changed the entire way that I operate. And so there's a huge role, I think, for what people are anecdotally calling reverse innovation, and learning how to do things in a different way than what we think we're supposed to do them. So that's been very, very helpful and very educational for me. This is a big topic within the world of global surgery. I don't know if anyone was at the ICS meeting this past week, but the presidential debate was, is the time for mission trips over? And I wasn't able to hear the entire argument, but there was essentially a pro saying we should not be doing any sort of clinical mission work. And all of our efforts should be focused on education, research, and quality improvement, which is a lot of what we're going to talk about for the rest of this talk. But I do agree with the con side as well, that there certainly is a role for us in clinical burden of disease. And some of our quote mission work, as long as it's with established institutions with local partners and locally driven in terms of what we're doing, is incredibly, incredibly beneficial. To really build successful global surgery partnerships, we have a lot of challenges. I think the silo analogy is probably most used in this field, in the sense that everyone sort of has their project. NGOs or non-governmental organizations work in one path, and our US academic institutions tend to work in another path, and we each have our individual partners. At UW, we have a great working relationship with a site in Ethiopia. Our plastic surgeons work in Nicaragua, and that's just where they go because that's where they've always gone and that's where they have a relationship. Surgical societies have often worked in silos as well and not really partnered together. And there's plenty of other people involved in the global space that we don't take advantage of working with. So these can be really difficult to sort of cross through those silos. And as Dr. Weiser alluded to, probably one of the most influential things in my early global surgery work was working with Dr. Tefera and having the benefit of seeing his work from the ACS side of things in building surgical training hubs. So back in about 2016, 2017, the American College of Surgeons elected to support multiple institutions working together around one individual site, so that institutions who maybe didn't have funding or the volume to support a full global surgery program would be able to offer their trainees opportunities to be involved, but also work with a site that was willing and able to host, to work together for things like research and quality improvement. And that's how we ended up developing this hub in Hawassa, Ethiopia. So Hawassa is a huge catchment area for Ethiopia. It's 20 million patients in southern Ethiopia. It's far from Addis. It's not necessarily easy to get to. The hospital itself has 480 beds, but they see 11,000 admissions a year. They have 10 fully functioning operating rooms. And I think the most important thing, they have 10 ICU beds with one critical care physician for 20 million people. So you can imagine the scope of the disease and what we were working with. One of the big successes of the partnership in Hawassa is that it was mostly led by the folks there in Hawassa. They told us what they wanted to work on. They told us what they needed help with. And I cut these notes in from one of our earliest work plan meetings because the third bullet point, which we wrote down, was such a big learning point for me and for a lot of the team, which was we have to consider the limitations with capacity and resources when we're planning our initiatives. The best laid plans can go awry if your host institution cannot support that or if you're overwhelming them. This came after our initial first 6 months of being involved with Hawassa. The plan was that one person from every institution was going to go there for 2 weeks, be on the ground, see what the actual resources were, and figure out how we could all work together. And what that actually did is stressed the Hawassa folks into the ability of not being able to do their own work because they were literally driving back and forth to the airport. They were picking us up. They were hosting us. They were taking a new person every 2 weeks and orienting them to the hospital. And they did not have the bandwidth to do that. So it was a big eye-opening experience of how easily your plans cannot work in the setting that you're intending them to work for. We worked really closely with Dr. Imnet Tesfaye, who is the critical care physician in that. And her earliest goals were to just describe what kind of difference did we make by having a critical care physician and a critical care pathway. And we were able to, with very limited data and pretty limited resources, actually write this up about a 40% change in overall mortality just by having a critical care physician. So it's pretty amazing what can be done. As many of you guys in the room probably know, the ACS hub model has been incredibly successful, and it's spread out to a second hub in Lusaka, Zambia, which some of you guys are going to be traveling to, I understand. They've done research quality improvement and laparoscopic skills workshops there on site, again, all led by the local faculty driving what initiatives were going to work there. And Hub 3 is in the works, should be starting up in Rwanda soon. So this has been a tremendously successful model to be a part of. I want to talk briefly about society partnerships. And again, this is sort of the opportunity, preparation is luck meeting opportunity. And right as the Association of Academic Surgery was starting to expand their Fundamentals of Surgical Research course into the COSEXA region was when I was fortunate enough to be chairing the Global Affairs Committee. And so in 2018, a pilot course was done in Rwanda, and it was successful with about 30 attendees. The mandate we had from the AAS was that this concept, the Fundamentals of Surgical Research course, they would fund us doing it for 5 years. But after 5 years, it had to be completely run by COSEXA with no more money and preferably no more involvement from us. And so we set off to try to do that in a very difficult setting because getting this meeting at the COSEXA meeting is something that happens in a different country every year. And so having local people that were able to take over the course and lead it became kind of a challenge. However, in 2019, we were able to do it in Kampala, Uganda. And we had a couple of the local faculty, particularly driving these talks here, which were specific to the COSEXA region. What kind of research challenges, what kind of promotional challenges, what kind of funding challenges do you have, and what are the opportunities? And it was super successful. We had 75 people come. They stayed through the entire thing, which, as many of you know, getting people to stay in the room for an entire full day course can be a challenge. So we were very fortunate to have them join us. And right as we had really good momentum and things were going really, really well, everything sort of stopped. And it forced us to completely park our initiatives. And how on earth are we going to continue to do global surgery when this is what everything looked like? Planes were parked, no one was going anywhere. And a lot of how we had traditionally done things was no longer going to be an option for us. So it essentially eliminated what we considered our normal way of collaboration. And now I'm going to refer to it as our traditional way, because I do think we've moved forward in a lot of what we're doing. It forced change not only in how we do our partnerships, but how we build relationships. And I think in hindsight, I can look at this a little more positively and say it really gave us a lot of opportunities for improvement, because time is our only non-expendable resource. And we had struggles with time even before COVID. We weren't able to be gone as long as we would like to be. You know, anytime you're operating internationally is time you're not here and you're not making money for your institution or earning, you know, there's plenty of cost benefit when you think about how long you're gone. So how do you keep that momentum when something unfortunate happens? How do you keep moving forward? And especially when you're forced into that change. So a lot of things pivoted to email and WhatsApp. A lot of things pivoted to Zoom meetings and even Zoom conferences. And for some of these things, if you've seen this episode of Friends, you know, no matter how hard you pivot, that couch is not fitting up those stairs. So you can't force things into different formats necessarily very easily. One of the first things that we were able to do was in 2020 shift the MCS exams for COSEXA, which is kind of like their OSCE. It's an exam of their mid-level residents, and it's really geared towards assessing basic knowledge and skills and some of their early decision making. And we were able to pivot that into a virtual setting, which was a phenomenal undertaking because, as I alluded to, we're talking about 14 different countries, multiple different sites, and doing something in a virtual format that had never been done before. Not to mention, when I looked at this picture and went back and looked at it to put it in the slides, you guys probably can't see this, but this is a Saturday at 5:04 a.m. and that's in Central Time. So for our colleagues here who were participating in this, that was really early or really late, depending on how you want to think about that. But we were able to actually successfully do it with very, very minimal bumps in the road on this one. But it did identify some struggles. If we were going to continue to do this in a virtual format, how could we make it successful? And what kind of things did we struggle with? Connectivity and bandwidth are a huge issue. A lot of our partners in low and middle income countries don't have the ability to be fully connected, camera on, full-blown Wi-Fi all the time. There's a big debate in people who do a lot of Zoom interactions about camera on versus camera off. I tend to favor camera off because I don't like looking at myself and I get very distracted. My division chief is an absolute camera on all the time. I want to see your faces. I want you engaged. And it can drive people nuts. But you have to understand, again, when you're working with really low bandwidth, you can't have camera on. And it's not an indicator that people are not paying attention or that they're not engaged. It's simply not an option. And so then it becomes a real struggle to just look at a bunch of camera off Zoom faces to try to build meaningful relationships. That can be really, really difficult. And then optimally, depending on what kind of content you're going to provide, you really should have some asynchronous availability for people to download or watch when they're able to. Again, you know, if you don't have Wi-Fi in the place where you're located, you're using your cellular data, which is often on a pay-as-you-go plan in some of these countries, to download and watch a lecture. That takes a tremendous amount of bandwidth. And then finally, especially with the AAS and with the research course, which we also tried to run completely virtually in 2020, some of that is proprietary content. So you can't make it available for download and watch anytime you want, because that's how a lot of these organizations make some money, is by providing this content, and it can't just be completely freely accessible. For our partnership in Hawassa, we tried to pivot to some remote journal clubs, M&Ms, teaching, conferences, things like that. And that worked fairly well. But again, we struggle with attendance, with bandwidth, and with figuring out an optimal time to do that. It was very challenging to bring in, faculty from this side of the world at a time that also worked for our partners in Ethiopia, because that's a pretty big time difference. So things we had to think about as we tried to implement this. Variable connectivity. We were doing really well in terms of had a routine recurring conference every single week. We had invited different faculty from different specialties. If the topic was transplant, we had transplant faculty. If we needed a cardiac person, we had cardiothoracic. We really were able to bring this together. And then construction in the hospital in Ethiopia cut the main power line into the hospital. So we lost all ability to do that. And then they had to move rooms, and then we didn't have Wi-Fi. And so months of really good momentum was kind of destroyed by something as simple as that. Time zones are a huge issue. We're going to talk about that a few times. And then obviously you guys know clinical burden is huge. In lower resource settings, it's even bigger. And there's just not the ability to say, I'm going to take off from 2 to 3 p.m. and be in a lecture every week. And then there can be some unclear roles about who's leading the conferences and who's actually responsible for what. So you have to set that up in advance and even troubleshoot that, I think, when you're going to do it in a virtual format. Remote conferences were something that we all tried, and I don't think any one of us really enjoyed for long periods of time. This was when the Association of Surgical Education meeting was completely virtual in 2021, and it was hours and hours of Zoom content. And that was pretty challenging for anyone to stay engaged for that long. And this is a screenshot of my computer, and I don't know what I was doing, but clearly down here I was scoring something because somebody's grades are here. So as much as we try, it's really difficult to stay engaged. So Zoom for things like that, it's good in theory, but again, there's a whole field of study on Zoom fatigue. How can you stay engaged remotely? And it's really, really difficult. We're all guilty of multitasking, right? Like that's one of the reasons that people argue against camera off is you're not paying attention. The need for pre-recording of your content and flexibility is incredibly important. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute in terms of some hybrid conference work that we did. And then questionably, is hybrid better? Rather than having something that's exclusively remote versus exclusively in person, is there a middle ground that we can do that allows everyone from whatever resource setting you're coming from whatever clinical practice you're coming from, to actually attend, get benefit from, and be a participant in some way that's meaningful? It's really hard, I think, to decide to build a new relationship in a completely remote setting. I think it can work well in a one-to-one setting, reaching out to students, trainees, people that want an individual one-on-one working relationship. You can certainly do a virtual introduction. We do that a lot now, but some of the aspects of communication are lost. And as I was going through data to prepare for this talk, it brought me back to some of the older literature about nonverbal communication and how much of that is lost in a virtual setting. And estimates are that it's about 50% of our communication is nonverbal. And so part of the reason that people get so tired, even after a 1-hour Zoom lecture or a Zoom interaction, is that your brain is trying to fill that other 50% of the context you would be taking from the nonverbal clues, the nods, the leaning forward to show interest, the sort of leaning back to be like, oh, maybe not. You don't really get that on Zoom, and it is actually very mentally taxing to try to interpret those context clues when you're not there in person. So we were all really thrilled when we were able to be back in person. And that happened for us, for a lot of us at least, in COSEXA in 2022 in Namibia. And we were able to return, and this lovely group of folks were able to be inducted as fellows into the college after long-standing history of collaboration and involvement in the region. So we were thrilled with that. And it's global surgery is a really tight-knit community, and it's very encouraging to see all of your friends. Just like any one of us go to conferences, I think a huge part of that is the social interaction and the networking that we have. The fundamentals course was able to return in person a few years after we had first started. This was probably the most well-attended version that we had. The agenda was completely driven by the local faculty. About half of the presenting faculty here on this agenda were local faculty from the COSEXA region. And we had for the first time, a really diverse level of attendees, from medical students all the way up to mid-career faculty looking for research engagement. So that was incredible. And there's the instructors for the course that year. And then somehow, miraculously, even in the setting of a pandemic and years of not being able to travel there in person. In 2023, the course was completely run by COSEXA with no involvement from us, no involvement from the AAS, and a complete local faculty. So we were actually able to transition that to them, and it was a real honor to have been a part of that, because I hope that's something now that they are going to take forward and have it be an annual part of their meeting and of tremendous value to their trainees. We were able to bring the FCS exams back in person as well in 2022, and this is the equivalent of their like American Board of Surgery exam, where you sit there and examine trainees, and we typically have anywhere from 5 to 15 trainees come through and do board scenarios. And I still say this is my favorite thing that I get to do every year, because as an examiner, it's tremendously challenging to assess an examinee and then figure out, is this a language barrier? Is this a knowledge deficit? Or is this a regional practice change? Because a lot of the answers are written in things that we would do. We would do, you know, a lumpectomy and local radiation. That's not what you're going to be able to do in a lot of those settings. So you have to understand that the trainees are giving you the board answer, but also what they would do. And it's just a really impressive opportunity, I think, for me as an examiner to grow and learn more about how we understand surgical knowledge. So what works well after all of those stories of the things that we did and how we moved through all of this? Things that I think work really well. Virtual and remote lecture series that are brief, recurring, and routine. They're scheduled, they're dedicated, people know that it's happening at this time and you can attend. The COSEXA lecture series, which I was really honored to be a part of this year, was devised to kind of highlight gaps in training. So the trainees and the faculty of the COSEXA training hospitals said, these are the things that we're not seeing a lot of and our trainees don't seem to know very well or aren't doing very well on exams, and created this lecture series. It is expected and protected time for the trainees to attend. And I will say it's the biggest Zoom audience I've ever had, because it was over 500 people listening to this. So they're invested in this, and it's something that's working very well in a remote setting. I would be remiss if I did not talk about the virtual examinations and assessments, a lot of which has come out of faculty here at this institution. The implementation of the Entrust system for COSEXA boards for the MCS exams in the last couple of years with Dr. Lin and Dr. Liebert has really changed the game for what we're going to do, and it's going to make a huge impact worldwide. So I am in awe of their work and honored to even see it be implemented in the COSEXA region. It's really fantastic, and it's allowed us to standardize some of the exams and the examiners. Virtual exams for the MCS has allowed us to eliminate some of the travel needs, and it allows really international participation of our examiners. And I'm going to highlight a little bit of the travel needs because it's difficult to go many places. Hybrid conferences are another way we can work on this. We were able to, through the AAGS, do a true hybrid session at the West African College of Surgeons this year with relatively low tech support. Here you can see the little owl, the remote conferencing owl. He came in my carry-on and made it there and back in one piece. But he's here on the table, and we had about 50 attendees in the room, and we had about 50 attendees on Zoom. And so it was really a way to say we can engage people. We can keep our local conference agendas, but we can allow people to zoom in for parts of it and see which parts work the best. So this was a really gratifying thing to do, and we're hoping to take this model forward at multiple other international conferences as we work in collaboration with a lot of other surgical societies. To go back to the travel issues, it's really difficult for people to travel. We have a lot of privilege with a US passport being able to go a lot of places, but I just pulled this from the Department of State. Really, these are the refusal rates last year for visas from these varying countries. You know, and it ranges anywhere from 22% of people from Mozambique applying for a visa were denied, all the way up to 71% from Rwanda. So even if we really pursue these bidirectional partnerships that we talk about all the time in global surgery, we can't get people going the other direction sometimes, even if they want to be there. And it's, you know, it's theoretical to look at it in this setting, but I'm going to show you this email from a couple of weeks ago. This was for our big ACS Hope Surgical Training Collaborative meeting in Washington, D.C., where we were bringing people from our Hawassa hub, from the Lusaka hub, and a lot of us that were involved in this. And this is the president of the Hawassa University Hospital saying, I'm sorry, my visa was denied, I can't go. And there's no way I can get an interview before the meeting to appeal it. So it's a real issue, and it affects our ability to really engage in a bidirectional manner. And so if we can do things that minimize the need for travel, especially at the trainee level, then hopefully we can make this more equitable for everyone involved. Time zones are a huge deal. We've talked about it a couple of times, but I'm just going to highlight, since I am on the West Coast, that you guys get the brunt of this. And I am aware that often our 6 a.m. Central Time meetings or 4 a.m. meetings for you guys. So for our partners here that have been involved in that, we're very grateful. It requires a lot of coffee, a lot of planning, and a lot of dedication to the task. Telehealth is something that we're working with our UW-Hawassa Collaborative. We have 2 machines from the World Telehealth Initiative, and this is something that works really, really well. We're able to zoom in for ICU rounds. We can see patients, they can see us, it's protected. And it's a way for us to be remotely present in a way that's meaningful and time sensitive and allows us to actually deal with patient interactions. We've done it first in the ICU setting, but our hope is that within the next year, with the finished construction of some of the new ORs, that we'll actually be doing this in the operating room as well and be able to provide real-time feedback, commentary, and assistance during actual operations. So what doesn't work very well? Obviously, those things work pretty good, but there's plenty that did not work well. Lengthy, entirely virtual conferences. We just don't have the bandwidth for that, either physically or technologically, and it just doesn't allow people to sit through 8 hours of Zoom is too much. We can't do it. I think it doesn't work very well in the early relationship building between multiple institutions. Trust kind of builds in those little innocuous moments that we have between meetings. It's the coffee breaks, it's the networking, it's the meeting people 5 minutes before you're going to give a talk and chatting about what you have in common. And we lose that communication when we have to go to a truly virtual setting. It's hard to replicate that sort of human interaction artificially. And then I think poorly timed efforts really don't work well. You have to have something at a time when people can actually attend. It's very difficult. You guys, we do traditionally our grand rounds and our M&Ms early in the morning before we actually get off to the operating room and get started. But if we were to allow our partners in low income country, say in Kenya, to join us, this is the middle of their OR day for them. This is very difficult and it's not easily accessible. However, if we want to do something early in the morning for them, that's midnight for us. So as much as I do love the protection of kind of not working outside of what we consider work hours, I think in the global surgery world, that's not always feasible. And so you just have to recognize the context that you're doing that in. So moving forward, we have a couple of recommendations. This is something that the American College of Surgeons actually put out, designed to talk about medical student training in the virtual world in the future of hybrid learning. So for preclinical and clinical years, make plenty of resources available that you can access online and on your own time. That's the most benefit you're going to get for letting those resources be available. It does give you some increased access to mentors across the country and across the world. We can set up a quick Zoom meeting, but you can also just continue to use the resources that are available at your fingertips. So other things that don't work well. Lectures, if you can't attend, you need to consider creating durable content that you can access when you can get to it. So I appreciate that these are recorded and available for people later. Meetings, only if you need them. Short, only when necessary. Make them time zone considerate. If you can talk via WhatsApp, if you can talk, on the phone, that is generally going to be more time efficient. Conferences, hybrid options, you got to have some plans for engagement of the remote participants. So I don't know how many people are on Zoom, but I know you're there and I appreciate you and I see you. And I'm grateful for that opportunity. Exams, I think you have to do a practice run. You got to ensure bandwidth and flow and how it's actually going to work, because if you wait till the actual go time, things can fall apart really quickly. And then for patient interactions, telehealth is something that we all have as a part of our practice now. I think that is a situation where you do have to have your cameras on. You have to try to ensure access and equity for all of your patients. One of my partners is big into the development of sort of our telehealth interactions and working with Epic closely. And it's great, but then we have our patients in rural Wisconsin that don't actually even have broadband internet yet. That's not a thing everywhere in the United States. And I think we forget that sometimes, and they don't know how, and they don't have the bandwidth to actually access telehealth. So your intervention is only as good as it's going to be used. And if it can't be utilized, it's not going to be particularly helpful. My last little soapbox that I'm going to go on is about the accessibility of educational resources. And this is one other way we're trying with the AAGS to break the mold. Nothing frustrates me more than looking for an article, particularly something that's geared towards a low-income country, and it's $31.50 to access it. Or this article here that was using touch surgery to improve surgical education in a low and middle-income country, and it's $24.95. So that's really, really difficult. And there are ways we can do better in terms of making this content available. One of those is the Journal of Global Surgery, which we in the AAGS are going to be partnering with. This is a really innovative model for making published data accessible to multiple people, free of cost, essentially. It's an online journal. It is Google searchable. It's not yet PubMed indexed, but after 2 years of consistent peer review, it will be. It is peer reviewed. Reviewers actually receive a stipend. It's small, it's $10, and it can be donated if you want to. But that is enough of an incentive to say we recognize that you're spending your time and energy on this, and we're grateful for it. The article is published at extremely low cost, and it is behind a paywall until that cost is recouped. And what that ends up being is $75. So you can pay $10 in PayPal to access the article once it's published, or you can pay 10 cents in Bitcoin, making it really easily accessible. And once it's funded, once you reach $75, the paywall's gone. It's free to everybody. And so in an effort to try to practice what we preach, my most recent medical student and I published our scoping review of surgical capacity building approaches in conflict settings in this journal. The 3 peer reviewers, we don't know who they were, but we know they were from 3 different continents, and one of them donated their stipend to a local charity. It was $76 to publish the paper, and it took 55 minutes for it to be funded and open access. So I think if we really want to see change, we have to emphasize that we're going to be the ones to drive it. And so this is a huge opportunity for us to provide some equity for our partners. The AAGS, as I alluded to, is trying to do that as well with some of our hybrid conference options and zooming in. So if there are international conferences that you think might be interested in doing something like this, we're certainly open for collaboration and trying to find ways to make this as inclusive as possible. And finally, I'm going to end with a couple of lessons learned. It's been a very interesting growth opportunity for me over the last couple of years because, number one, change is hard. I'm a Taurus and I'm an Enneagram type 1. I don't like when things change. So it was a tremendous difficulty for me to take going from traveling across the world and doing all the things that I loved in international settings to not being able to do any of that. So to quote my favorite Ted Lasso, you know, it's taking on a challenge like this is a lot like riding a horse. If you're comfortable while you're doing it, you're probably doing it wrong. Eventually, you'll get more comfortable doing it, as anyone who's ridden a horse can tell you. You'll figure out how to make it work. You're not going to have all the answers. It can be really difficult to figure out what to do in these settings. And, you know, you're not expected to have all the answers. The public health training in me allows me now to go in without having to feel like I have the answer and this is the answer and this is the way, you know, there is a fracture and I'm going to fix it. I don't do that anymore. So I just sort of listen to my gut, and on the way down, check in with your heart. You'll figure out what's right. Give yourself some credit. We've done a lot of amazing work, and I think we have a lot more to do, but we're in this for the right reasons. I have the best job on the planet, and I love that I get to do this every single day. So as Ted says, don't sell yourself short. The rest of that quote is sell yourself tall and have it altered later. So as someone who tops out at 5'2" on a good day, I lean in with that. But for my final piece of wisdom, I'm going to pivot a little bit from Ted to my actual favorite character in the show, which is Roy Kent. And I did alter this slide a little bit from the way the quote actually is phrased, but go out there and have some fun. We have the best job on the planet, and I get to go and do it across the world with my friends, with my trainees, with my international partners. And I am just incredibly lucky to get to do that. And I'm also incredibly lucky to get to be here today and talk to you guys. So thank you so much for the opportunity, and I would be happy to take any questions that y'all have.